Hi, welcome everybody, and thanks for tuning in. This is the third roundtable discussion hosted by the Peak Keepers, a group of community members, scientists, sports people who are deeply concerned about the impact of industrial wind on our state of Vermont. And today's discussion is going to focus on specifically the impacts of industrial wind on wildlife habitat in the state of Vermont. So we're really lucky today. We have four fantastic panelists who I'm going to introduce. But first, my name is Will Amadon. I'm a geologist at Middlebury College, focused on land use change. To my right is Bill Kilpatrick. He is a mammologist at the University of Vermont, lives here in Burlington. Then we have Sue Morse, who is a wildlife ecologist based in Jericho. We have Will Statz from Victory, Vermont, who's also a lifetime wildlife biologist and woodsman. And finally, we have Justin Lindholm from Rutland, who's also a longtime woods person and explorer of the Vermont woods. So what we're going to do to start, we're going to go around and each introduce ourselves a bit more in depth and say a bit about why we're here. And then Sue will tell us a bit about what the Peak Keepers are and what our mission is. So Bill, do you want to?
Sure, I'll be glad to start. I'm a professor at the University of Vermont, where I study zoology and natural history of mammals and other vertebrates. I have conducted environmental studies at a number of the proposed wind turbine sites in the state of Vermont, and I've also provided testimony on nearly every proposed wind turbine project within the state to the Public Service Board.
And again, I'm Sue Morris, and I'm a lifelong naturalist and advocate of wildlife habitat. I study and teach wildlife habitat interrelationships, ecology, if you will. People know me for my work with Keeping Track, and while I'm not here today technically on behalf of Keeping Track, certainly familiarity with what's really out there on the ground is I think, critical, and more study is needed if we're going to really cite any facilities in our wild mountains.
Will Statz again. I've spent a lifetime both playing and working at high elevation habitats. I've worked on two wind projects, complete from the beginning to complete construction with environmental review, walking the places before it happened and so forth. You know, I started at an early age trapping at high elevations for fisher and bobcats and began to realize the sensitivity of this habitat and how fragile it was, and to the point, as a biologist, I helped negotiate a high elevation agreement for timber harvest over in northern New Hampshire in 1996, and so I've reviewed Act 250s in Vermont at high elevation timber harvest, and also actually as an industrial forester did some timber harvest at higher elevation. So I've got a pretty good feeling for what happens up there, and this is an interest of mine from a long time back.
Again, Justin Lindholm. My claim to fame here is not that I have a degree, and I love to be around people who really have a lot more knowledge than I have, but what I've done is I have visited and extensively looked at a lot of these sites. In fact, I think all of the sites in this region before the turbines went up and after the turbines have been put up, to see the differences in the naturalness before and what has happened since.
Great, so we got some great perspectives here today. And Sue, as our most veteran member of the team, is going to give us a little background about what exactly Peak Keepers is as an organization.
We felt strongly that we needed to get more Vermonters and generally people throughout New England familiar with the other side of the story. And certainly in the past, I think the press has given a lot of print space and airspace to why we need to build the facilities, and a little tiny bit on why we shouldn't, but it's been pretty one-sided. More recently, it's getting very gratifying to us to see that shift taking place, and there's more legitimate interest in the scientific underpinnings of the argument against wind. And so that's part of what our feeling is that we want to make that science available to Vermonters.
Fantastic. Well, I think we'll kick things off by hearing from Justin, who, as he said, is someone who has spent inordinate hours in the woods, has literally hiked and experienced many of the existing wind installations and proposed installations. And, you know, I guess, Justin, the first question I'd pose to you is, as someone who's been up there before and often after when you can, you know, what are the biggest changes that you're seeing on these ridge lines? What would people expect to see if they went up there?
The biggest change you'll notice immediately is the difference in sound. Before, the sounds are all natural, most of the time quieter, except when the wind blows hard. Afterwards, there is a mechanical sound, a whooshing sound, a whump, whump, whump type sound, and I've experienced this whump, whump, whump type sound out to 3 miles while sitting in the woods. It actually feels a lot like a vibration more than a sound itself. Now, we have a video, 45 seconds, which will show the difference between the sound in one spot. We did this video in the same spot before the turbines went up, and we did this video in the same spot after the turbines were operating, and you'll see quite the difference. I think the best thing is for me to walk across that log, stand by that dead tree. The first picture I would like to show, you'll see that it has a lot of trout lilies and other spring flowering plants. You see the beauty of this place. It makes you feel like you want to just lie down in there and take a nap. The second picture is the same idea. That's a springtime picture. Now, that second picture with that person there, that is a trough. It's a flat bottom trough, and this is at Lowell. Flat bottom troughs were built by the glaciers, and they're carved out of the mountains. Very rare to find a flat bottom trough. Most of them are irregular rounded bottoms or V-bottom troughs. And the unique features, I've been all through the woods in the Northeast, I've only seen this one feature in triplicate in this one place where you step out of this trough. This was the biggest one. There's another one right beside it and another one right beside that. These troughs have been destroyed. That picture that you're seeing with that person in it is no longer there. If we could see the next picture with a car in it, that is what that looks like now. And the first picture the same way. Both the first and second pictures were that spot. This is now totally destroyed. You wouldn't feel like laying down in this and taking a nap. It's gone. These troughs, I'm one of the few who's seen them. Nobody else ever will see this triplicate of troughs, flat bottom troughs, and that's not right. The next picture, you'll see the cool, dark forest with the wetland right in the middle of it. That is one of the best pictures. We've shown this to a lot of people, and I've been in there many times. And it's cool, it's quiet, it's dark, mysterious. It feels like stepping into a cathedral. You don't want to talk when you're in a place like that. Every step you take is a quiet step. And this is the kind of stuff that was there before. And now you can go to the next slide. You can see there's a place that is hot, shimmering heat waves. The color is gray, not green. The dominant color is gray. It's just not a beautiful color at all. And then go to the next slide, and you can see the dust. These are very hot areas. The tops of these mountains are now being heated. They have a microclimate of their own, which is entirely different from the cool, settling climate that animals like moose would lie in the summertime to stay cool. And now we've just totally disrupted that. And the waters up there are also going to be warmed up right at the source. Now, we do have a water video that shows the droplets of water at the very top of Lowell Mountain as they're ready to begin their adventure to the sea. It's almost like these droplets are winking at us before they take off. And we should show that video next. Now, the next picture that I'd like to see is going to be showing the stagnant waters up on Lowell. That's a spreader pond, settlement pond type of idea. And the water is exposed to the sun. It's going to be hot. It's going to be brown or gray. You can show the next video, the next picture shows another settlement pond that has gray water in it. There used to be clear water up there. Everything was clear. It was cold. You put your hand in the water up there in the woods in the past, and you'd have to pull your hand out after a few seconds. It was so cold up there. But now this is what we've got, and the whole situation with the water has changed. Now, how have the wildlife been affected? Okay, this is now a hard hat area. If we see the next picture, all of these areas, they warn people you have to stay out. It's very dangerous. You have to go through programs for safety. You have to wear hard hats if you're going to be up there extensively. This is not a wildlife habitat area when you see stuff like this. Lots of noise. Everything is just different. Now, if we could see the next video, please. That one is the Grandpa Knob Ridgeline looking from south to north. Look how beautiful that is. Even the state of Vermont has come up with the proposal that this should not be disturbed because it is an important wildlife corridor, both across it and from north to south and south to north. And we'll see the next the next picture. This is what happens. We get habitat fragmentation, and that right there is Lowell Mountain. You can see the animals can't go along that ridge. They're going to be totally exposed up there. They're out of their element. And even going across is not, we're going to see a video, I keep saying video, but we're going to be seeing pictures soon, which will show how they can't cross, especially deer and moose. It's just a totally destroyed habitat that was very important. Now, if we could see the next video. I keep saying video. Been in the woods too long. See the ferns there? That is a place up in Lowell. Under those ferns is a wet area underneath, down about 12 inches. There's actual water. I've actually stuck a stick down through these ferns, and the water is down there 12 inches. You pull the stick back out, it's all water down there. The moose would put moose beds all over that place during the summer. Moose cannot stand heat. They don't like anything above 50 degrees. And they would lay in those ferns, and moose beds everywhere up there. And that is exactly, that spot with the ferns is exactly a spot that has been totally blown apart. They will not be there anymore. Next picture, please. Whoops, looks like we've made a little mistake there. That's not the deer picture I was looking for. Next picture, please.
Cute, though.
There, we've got some deer. Now, the problem here with the deer and the moose, they're hoofed animals. And if I could show you the next picture, you see all that crushed rock that's around the sides of these roads. And this is, they can't go through this stuff without breaking their legs if they're on the run. And I've learned this from hunting deer, that you have to stay away from even the old talus slopes, even old talus slopes that have soil on top of them. The deer will not go through there because they're worried about their hoofs, their feet breaking, and they'll stay right out of that stuff. Now, also the next the next picture, please. That's a bear-scarred beach, and that one happens to be down in the Deerfield area. And you can see that the bears have gone up there to eat the beech nuts. And the next pic, there he is. He's right up there right now. These bears do not like climbing trees with any civilization around. They're very vulnerable when they're up in a tree. And bears are very secretive. Of course, everybody can say there's bears been seen probably in Burlington and Rutland and whatever, but that's not their natural habitat. They're more secretive than that on the whole. Next pictures. Up there on Lowell, I saw this raptor of some sort. He's a predator bird, and he and I were actually playing with each other for a while. Very quiet up there at the time, and the wildlife seems to feel better when it's quiet. They'll come around you more, and you won't see things like that up in Lowell right now with the wind turbines. These animals, their hearing is one of their major senses. The average animal can hear probably 5 times better than we can anyway, and they use that to their advantage. The next thing, how do we mitigate? Yeah, we could probably mitigate. Next picture, please. You see all of that blasted stuff. We've got cliffs out there and winding roads. That can be mitigated. You build another mountain right beside it. It only took nature 400 years to build this one. I don't see how else you do mitigate. 1,000 years from now, you're going to tell, or not us, but somebody's going to be able to tell that was an industrial site 1,000 years from now. And so anyway, that's my presentation for the start.
Yeah.
And we can go from there.
Well, thanks a lot, Justin. You know, I think it's just fantastic to hear from someone who's actually been to these places. You know, I think one of the biggest problems with public perception of wind is that really a lot of people don't have a sense for what these places looked like before development and after development. So it's really important to hear from people who are actually up there on the ground. So, you know, all of your images really set the stage beautifully for this question of what is wind actually doing to the habitat, and who's losing here? Obviously, wildlife is losing. And so I wonder if we could turn to you now, Sue, and pick up on some of the kind of seeds that Justin planted. You know, he mentioned, for example, habitat fragmentation. I know that's something that you've talked about in past episodes, this idea of these core habitat units and what happens when they're broken apart.
Yes, well, they're really critically important, and worldwide scientists are pretty much unanimous in recognizing that habitat fragmentation and habitat loss, both, often synonymous, are really, really compromising biodiversity. And really, if we were really honest with ourselves, we would draw great big red lines around remaining core habitats worldwide and stay out of them and only visit them in the most unobtrusive way.
So what is a core habitat? Is that the same thing for all animals, or is that different?
No, it depends on the organisms you're talking about. But for our purposes here today, I'm sure talking about wide-ranging carnivores, for example, and some of the herbivores that Justin just mentioned, we're talking about larger habitats that haven't been fragmented with road systems and a lot of human infrastructure, and our presence in those habitats is not a dominant feature. You know, we're occasional visitors. We occasionally hike or bird or hunt or trap, but we're not there day and night, year round. And these are habitats where, as Justin has said, wildlife have their privacy. They have their refugia. They have habitats where they know where various kinds of foods can be found and where various kinds of security habitats and cover can be found. We've recently learned that lynx are here in Vermont, and I'm very excited about that because I've studied lynx in other parts of North America. And here's an animal in the higher elevation habitats where some of these wind facilities are being installed and want to be installed. This will be a disaster for lynx, not only for the landscape scale movement of lynx to Vermont and undoubtedly New Hampshire too, and throughout our region from core habitat to core habitat. These ridge lines, these mountains serve as preferred travel routes for lots of animals, and lynx undoubtedly are among them. And here we see lynx in softwood cover. That's one of the reasons why they're in softwood habitats. Spruce, fir, these are habitats that are characterized by deep snow and deep cold. And this next picture shows you what to look for if you think you're seeing a lynx. This is an animal with long ear tufts and a solid black-tipped tail. It's very different than cousin bobcat. And were you to see its feet, it has bedroom slippers for feet. They're much, much bigger than cousin bobcat's feet because they're designed for that deep snowed, powder snow, deep cold habitat. Here's a side profile of a Canada lynx. One of its many names is ghost cat, and certainly in Justin's sensibilities, I'm as aesthetically drawn to these habitats as I am as a scientist trying to understand how nature works. The name ghost cat, I once saw a lynx in Alberta peering at me through a lattice work of spruce branches, and my first impression was it was an apparition. It was a ghost. I could just see parts of its face. And, you know, this is a kind of ambassador of a purer, better time, a time before, certainly before our ruinous enterprise that always wants to change nature and plunk our stuff out there and our disturbing influences. Of course, this next picture of the snowshoe hare is critical to the lynx's well-being. It's a principal prey species for lynx, as much as 90% of their diet, depending on season and locale. And so again, as we seek to understand where lynx want to be in northern New England, we pretty much have to overlap that with suitable habitat, including an abundance of snowshoe hare. One of the problems with habitat fragmentation, however, is that we introduce roads into these habitats, massive roads. We dynamite all over the place, and you'll see more images of that later when Will speaks. But this introduces other carnivores that historically didn't use these higher elevation, thick softwood habitats with deep powdery snow. Suddenly animals like coyotes and fishers and even cousin bobcat can access these higher habitats, and they are in direct competition with an animal like lynx, or for that matter, marten. And so this is disturbing to think about because we're unwittingly changing what really functions as optimal habitat for one species and facilitating the introduction of others. And we may hear more about that with respect to birds later on. So fishers, for example, as we see here in coyotes, are known exploiters of our roads and interruptions in core forests. And that poses a problem even on our lower ridge lines, say Georgia Mountain, for example, which heretofore has functioned as a kind of sanctuary for animals. White-tailed deer are suddenly at risk because suddenly there's, in the winter especially, ways for other animals to get up there and get into some of those softwood habitats where deer may be seeking to conserve their energy and be for the winter. And year-round, you know, the well-being of whitetail is directly related to their ability to unimpeded seek out quality habitats out there that provide them with optimal foods by season and as they are available. So suddenly the introduction of roads and people and dogs and people using roads is going to change that for these animals.
So I want to follow up on one question, which is, you know, when we think about the habitat fragmentation, we think a lot about roads, clear cuts, a lot of these on-the-ground things. But getting back to something Justin mentioned was sound. And I don't know if you've talked about this in previous discussions, but does the noise from these turbines actually kind of cast a radius of habitat destruction that is independent of even what's happening on the ground?
Well, to be perfectly honest with you, some studies have proven that it can have both positive and negative impacts. They observed an increase in pollinators, for example, in a study that was done out west, but a decided decrease in the recruitment of tree species as facilitated by the small mammals that would gather and disperse their seeds and use their seeds in their foraging behaviors. So that's two impacts. Certainly, the sound of wind facilities can prevent birds from being able to hear one another, so the reproductive season could certainly be compromised accordingly. Predators would have a tougher time hearing and hence being able to access prey satisfactorily. Similarly, prey might have a tough time avoiding predators. So there's definitely impacts that are being documented in the literature now. And something you were saying earlier, Bill, when we met for breakfast is so true. We just need more study. We need more science on the ground, more people on the ground. You can't, with a sweep of the arm, decide that it's an appropriate place to put an industrial facility without having spent the dirt time really learning what's going on out there. And that's what we haven't done here. And that's what's so disturbing to many of us.
Yeah, I'd very much like to get back to that topic of how exactly a wildlife biologist goes about studying the impacts and the existing wildlife. I don't know if that's something we want to get into now or come back to later.
Well, I think we'll all be certainly revisiting that subject later, but I'll just quickly say now, you know, as a professional tracker and habitat, a teacher of habitat monitoring techniques, we really need both our professional scientists as well as citizen scientists and avid sportsmen, people like Justin here, to really spend time out there looking and gathering more knowledge. We don't have that information today, and we're learning. I mean, witness, we have a new mammal and a couple new bat species in recent months, so that's pretty exciting. This picture of the dead moose on the road, for example, I don't want to quit without mentioning that. You know, moose and deer are definitely being displaced by this activity in their former private habitats, and when they come down and try to find alternative food resources and just place to be anywhere near us and our infrastructure, they get hammered. And I think everybody in the audience can appreciate the wisdom of keeping it whole and not cutting it and fragmenting it with roads and human activity. And last but not least, this black bear, this icon of the wild in our mountains. There's just no reason to believe that introducing still more human perturbations and human infrastructure in high elevation habitats is going to be good for bears. I don't agree with those that maintain that the early cereal growth is going to be sought after by bears. They need their privacy, as Justin has said. They need places to be cool in the hot of summer. Male bears definitely have a known preference for high elevation denning habitats where they can be left alone, and that's been going on for probably hundreds of years. They've known a good way to get away from us is to get way up there where for us it's too hard to get to. But it turns out there are food resources up there that these animals need too, and bear and marten, for example, really like a lot of the fruit that the higher elevation habitats make. I was on Seneca Mountain recently, and I've never seen such a stand of viburnum as up there. It's just hell to walk through, but if you're an animal looking for food just about now, that's the place to be. So
I'll just make one kind of clarifying point, which is this talk about we keep coming back to the idea of high elevation habitat. And for those of you who might not be familiar with the pattern of wind development, it happens almost exclusively above 2,000 feet in Vermont, just by the nature of wind speeds here. So when we keep coming back to that high altitude habitat, that's because virtually all wind development is going to take place at high elevation locations. Will, you seemed like you wanted to jump in there. Did you have something to add?
Well,
or I have a question for you.
You know, we talk about the need for more study, and unfortunately our patience level is rather short, particularly when we're rushing to develop places and for various reasons. And wildlife study takes years. It's expensive. As Sue says, it takes boots on the ground. It takes willing professionals and citizen scientists to take the time, and it takes time to see those patterns over time and understand it. We learn bits and pieces as we go. We forget some of what we know and we relearn bits and pieces. And so I agree with Sue, and I'm sure Bill would agree as well, is that there hasn't been enough study for any of this. We haven't even scratched the surface regarding what impacts these installations may or may not have on what species. because each species has its own set of requirements. These mountains developed over thousands and thousands of years, and that ecosystem developed with it over thousands of years. And these animals adapted to it over thousands of years. So you can't put that on its head in a year or two and understand it in a year or two. So that's a challenge for us as professionals. There's no doubt about that. So.
Indeed, and I think I'll still push that off. I want to come back to the process of a site investigation, but first I want to follow up with you. Sue showed that picture of the moose, and I think Justin talked about how important this high elevation habitat is for moose because they like it cool. And I know that as someone who has spent a lifetime in northern Vermont and New Hampshire, you know a lot about the habits of moose at high elevation. And could you comment on or develop a bit more about why these places are special for moose and maybe any observations you've had?
Well, a couple of things. One is, all of us around this table are extremely concerned about climate change, and moose is a great example. Moose overheat very easily, both winter and summer. We're very concerned. We're seeing localized moose populations dropping all across North America, in fact, in some places. Some jurisdictions, they're doing okay. Some jurisdictions are actually increasing. But here in the Northeast, we have some real concerns about moose populations. And moose need these cool places. These high elevation areas in the summertime have a lot of seeps, a lot of cool places to be. Justin had a great picture showing that. And if I walk hundreds of miles in the springtime looking for shed antlers. It's sort of a hobby of mine. And not only do I find shed antlers at some of these high elevations because moose winter there, but I'll also find, I was talking to Sue about earlier, is that these cool, damp places where these cows will have their calves, but they can also thermoregulate better in these cool places. It's very important. They can't lay in the middle of a gravel road and cool down. They've got to get into these spring seeps and so forth and bed down. In the wintertime, a phenomenon that we've known for decades now is these moose will tend to migrate up to these higher elevations. Not all moose will, but a lot of them will, and we call these moose winter concentration areas. It's like the deer yard that we talk about, where the deer go in the wintertime. The moose go up to these higher elevations. Why? It's great habitat. There's softwood cover for them, and there's a lot of browse opportunities with either hobblebush, as Sue's alluded to, the viburnums. Mountain ash is a favored food of moose up there. So that puts those moose up there, and we've spent, as a biologist, I yearly go up into these areas, see the health of the herd and so forth, and so you're setting up a conflict there. You've got these concentration areas that are important for moose, both for cooling in the summertime and then wintering in the wintertime, and then you're putting an industrial scale development, whatever it may be, whether it's wind or something else, right in that heart of moose habitat. We don't know just what a long term that would mean for these, but I can tell you moose appear to be struggling right now due to warmer temperatures and other factors. We're not entirely sure what that is. There are parasites, winter tick, we've talked an awful lot. We've had some mortality studies. There will be some more mortality studies in the Northeast here in the near future. I was just at the International Moose Conference about a month ago. There are researchers from all over the world talking about what's going on with moose, what do we need to be concerned with, and so forth. So it's a real concern.
Yeah, interesting. And are there other species that are kind of equally reliant on these high elevation habitats that?
Well,
I know Sue mentioned a few. I don't know if you.
Yeah, I might as well jump into it. One of the animals that I feel is, I joke about, the poster child of mammals for high elevation is the American marten, and I think I might have a picture in my slides when we get to it. But yeah, that's an animal that over the decades that I've been looking, kind of following its development here in Vermont. It's classified as endangered in Vermont. It's classified as threatened, state listed in New Hampshire. And we tend to find it at high elevations for a number of reasons. We just completed a 2-year study on American marten in northern New Hampshire. If we want to talk about thanks for that picture showing the marten, it's a species that's very sensitive to landscape changes, as well as changes in stand structure and so forth. We consider American marten an umbrella species. And what are we talking about, an umbrella species? They need large, relatively unfragmented blocks of forest land. And frankly, if that land is healthy for marten, it's healthy for many other species as well, as we know, as an umbrella species. So it's critical that these animals are healthy, that we maintain viable populations and maintain the habitat that supports viable populations of animals like marten. Why else are they up at high elevations? In that high elevation forest ecosystem, there's great complex structure up there. These forests are older, so we tend to get a lot of deadened down trees that provides them protection from predators. It also gives them access to prey underneath the snow. Marten, we use the fancy word subnivean spaces. They go under the snow to hunt sometimes. And so these older forests produce a lot of that kind of material. Where are older forests left in Vermont? They're up on the mountaintops. That's all we have essentially. A few remnants at lower elevations. Marten can live at lower elevations. They do in some jurisdictions. But here in Vermont, it's the higher elevations that's fulfilling those habitat requirements that marten need. And the other thing that happens with those higher elevations is deeper snow. Again, we're very concerned about climate change because where is the snow still going to be as climate change occurs? At the higher elevations. So why is the deep snow important? Because marten have a lighter footload, they're a smaller animal, and they can outcompete fisher and other predators that Sue has alluded to in what she was talking about. These fisher can kill marten where they coexist, and they can also, as Sue said, compete for food resources up there. So, you know, that's why we tend to find these marten at higher elevations. Also, they really need, particularly leaf-off seasons, i.e. fall, winter, they need coniferous and mixed forest because they need that cover to protect them. They don't store a lot of body fat. They don't have much body fat on them. So they get cold easy. They got to keep moving, they got to feed, but that softwood cover, just like in deer yards that Justin knows about, it's relatively warmer under there, cuts the wind. So they need that mixed wood cover, that soft, dense softwood cover. Where are a lot of our coniferous forests? The top of the mountains. So that's why you find marten there as well.
So, you know, this issue has come up a couple times now of climate change, right? And you're talking about the importance of the coniferous forest, which I know is, a lot of people are speculating may be being replaced upwards by deciduous forests in the face of climate change. And a lot of other habitat changes are coming down the pipe with climate change. And I wonder if any of you guys would comment on this seeming irony where, you know, one of the main justifications for wind energy is to try to stem the tide of climate change. Yet it seems like in Vermont, one of the things that's happening is if we destroy a lot of our habitat with wind installations, in the name of fighting climate change, we're actually going to be destroying the very things we're trying to protect. And
I'll let someone else jump in, but I do want to emphasize, you're absolutely right. Only 3% of Vermont is lands located above 2,500 feet. It's a very minuscule portion of our habitat type here in this state, and yet it serves an enormous purpose, as we've all been talking about here. And those places are going to be the last resistant places to climate change, those mountaintops.
I refer to them as the lifeboat areas. When we have climate change, that is their last resort. And I think of it as the place that we really need to preserve.
And if you look at a landscape scale map of New England, you realize that our higher elevation mountains and flanking ridge lines are really a life support system of connectivity. You know, they really provide a means for all sorts of animals and insects and birds and others to use the larger landscape and follow those, I call them preferred travel routes. It's not always appropriate to call them corridors, but they're really, really essential. So as animals are adapting to climate change and trying to sort out what next, they need to be able to exercise those essential choices. You know, where do I go next and how do I get there safely? Certainly not crossing through the lower elevation habitats that are dominated by our farms and our villages and our cities. That's not going to work for a lot of these animals.
Indeed, you know, this brings up something in my mind, which, you know, a lot of this conversation comes back to the scope of wind energy. And I think, at least personally, you know, perhaps there's room for a small amount of wind generation, but when you start to think about blowing up wind as a major portion of our energy portfolio, and you start multiplying each of these destroyed ridgelines and destroyed high elevation habitats down the chain of the Green Mountains, you know, it really scares me as far as thinking about eradicating these sanctuaries.
As Sue says, and Justin alludes to too, is that just like the rivers, the mountain ridge lines stitch our state together, and that they're contiguous, and for the most part, and allows that genetic exchange of wildlife species up and down these spines, these ridges, not only in Vermont, but over to New Hampshire, up to Quebec, over to Maine. These places, these critters can travel and feel relative solace and not encounter the type of development that Sue talks about at lower elevations. So, very important.
Well, you mentioned genetics in passing, and we actually have
That's right.
a mammal geneticist sitting next to me who we haven't gotten involved in the conversation yet. And so Bill Kilpatrick, you are really an expert in a number of mammals, but in particular on bats, which are actually a mammal. I believe I learned again this morning. And bats obviously have been in the news a lot as being one of the species that are, or mammals, not a species, that are threatened by wind turbines. A lot of proven instances of bat kill associated with large wind installations. And before we get on to talking about fatality, I wonder if you could just give us a quick overview on how bats behave. You know, what's their role in the ecosystem? Why are they important? Why should we care that you know, bats are at risk?
Sure, we have, well, bats play a major role in ecosystems throughout the world, but in Vermont we have 9 species of bats here, and they are all predominantly insectivorous bats, feeding on insects of a variety of sorts. Some of the bats hibernate and spend essentially the whole year in Vermont, or at least within the Northeast. And these are the bats that especially have been recently hit by the white nose syndrome condition and kill literally millions of these species, or these individuals, within the Northeast. The other 3 species are primarily migratory bats. So they enter the Northeast, typically in the springtime, as early as April, and then they migrate out of the area after spending the summer here, after having their young here, and they generally are gone by mid-October. And these are the bats that are especially hit by the wind industry and the wind turbines. And there's a lot of regional variation in bat mortality at wind sites, but it happens that the ridge lines along the Northeast is the highest area of effect. And on average, there's about 27 bats killed per turbine per year. And you talk about cumulative effects. There's a migratory species that has to fly the gamut from moving from the Northeast to, let's say, Vermont, all the way to Florida. Think about the number of wind forms that it potentially has to pass through. So successfully moving through all that is quite unlikely. So I think there is a real cumulative effect of the various exposure of these bats as they move along this. And that's something that we're just really beginning to consider and think about in detail.
That's interesting. I can imagine adding that additional stress to a bat's life is a difficult implication. So, you know, it's not clear to me, and maybe not to the viewers, so how exactly do turbines kill or affect bats? I know they can obviously probably fly into a turbine, but there's also other ways that they can be impacted.
Well, people see the turbines turning, and I think they have no concept of how large they are in the scale. So a turbine, like on Sheffield or on Lowell, if it's turning at 10 revolutions per minute, which is a moderate speed for these turbines, they'll operate up to 25 revolutions per minute. The tips of those blades are turning at about 173 miles per hour. Bats typically fly at about 5, 6, the fastest one's about 11 miles per hour. So yeah, that is one of the causes of mortality, as the bats are struck by the turning blades. Blades are turning much faster than they perceive them. The other one, though, is that's only one of the areas of mortality, and the turning turbine blades actually then causes changes in wind pressure or air pressure. And so this is kind of equivalent to a scuba diver who surfaces too fast. So the bats then fly from a low pressure area into a high pressure area, and or vice versa actually, high pressure into a low pressure, and the gases in their circulating fluid come out real quickly out of their blood, and essentially their lungs rupture. This is known as barotrauma, and probably as much as 30 or 40% of the total mortality results from that.
Interesting. How does we talked about a lot of the overlap as far as wind development and ground mammals. Is there a similar overlap problem with bats, or not as much, as far as do bats prefer high elevation as well, or are they more or less happy throughout the ecosystem?
There's some good indication that, at least in the eastern United States, that bats do really migrate along these ridge lines. So they are using these as their travel corridors, and this is certainly true of songbirds to some extent. They will follow these ridge lines when they are migrating in the spring and in the fall. So these certainly are specialized areas that they do utilize. Bats are, of all the mammals all the animals that are potentially impacted by industrial wind, we probably know more about bats than any others. And in part that's because this is a group that there is a major direct effect. There's a number of bats that are killed. And when we talk about the mortality, we've talked a little bit about the necessity of studies. Estimating the amount of bats that are killed is much more complex than just going out and counting the number of dead bats under the turbines. You've got to take into consideration a lot of other aspects. The amount of area that you can actually survey, the ability of the person who's doing the survey to actually detect or find the dead bats, and what proportion then of bats have been carried away by scavengers. So it becomes a very complex formula to get to an estimation of the number of bats that are actually killed at a wind turbine site.
I suppose you have to be out there in the right season as well.
Absolutely, and you have to be out there at a certain frequency. So the fewer the days between the actual going out and surveying for bats, the less scavenging that's going on. If you wait too long, then you've got most of it's been lost by scavenging. So have to take all of those issues into consideration.
Well, this seems like a great point in the conversation to get into this idea, which interests me personally quite a bit. What's the kind of process if a wind installation is proposed? Viewers may be interested in learning what's the process that the state needs to go through, that the developer needs to go through to determine the impacts on wildlife. How does that process typically play out? Who are the players, and what are the kind of shortcomings that you might see? And I suppose we could use bats as a test case, since that's one of the, I suppose it's been one of the focal species of interest.
Going to leave this one for me?
Well,
I can jump in.
I'll jump in at some point.
Okay, I'll start out. Since I've been involved in that aspect of it quite a bit, it varies greatly from state to state what's required. Vermont generally does require some pre-construction survey work to determine if there's any endangered species of plants or animals that are going to be on the site. And specifically then, they require studies of bird and bat activity along the proposed sites. And this is done generally by acoustical monitoring to detect bats, as well as radar to detect flights of birds and bats that are coming through during these migration periods. So there's fairly intensive studies that are going on. Unfortunately, what we know is that these pre-construction surveys don't always predict well what's going to happen post-construction. So there's a lot of potential problems that can arise from that. The other issue is that the wind industries, the developers then have much deeper pockets for the most part, so they go out and hire their experts to go out and conduct many of these studies. And then there's difficulty in finding people who can review and evaluate that work that's been done, or to do independent work on the particular sites. So I see that as a real disconnect. That it's all left to one side's hired expert without a lot of peer evaluation of that information. And there's just not funding for the most part to take care of that situation. I'll let other people jump in.
I've been going to the Arctic now, for this will be my 6th year of studying caribou and their colleagues in the Arctic. And as a consequence, I've become increasingly more aware of a whole new branch of science, if you will, that I think is sadly missing here, and that's called cumulative effects assessment. The understanding that all the human-caused perturbations that go on out there over space and time have cumulative, often synergistic impacts on animals. And apropos of what Bill's been saying, we're taking just a passing glance at it, often by one side but not another, and we don't begin to have the knowledge we need to have about what's happening to bats over generations of time, what's happening to reproductive rates, what's happening to recruitment rates of marten or lynx. We're not there long enough, and we're not asking the broad-based questions that should be asked.
So what are the kind of different time scales, if you had to arm wave a bit, versus a typical study associated with a wind development versus what would really be the time scale needed to actually get at some of these cumulative effects?
Wow, I wouldn't personally go there. I'll just conclude my comments by saying we don't belong putting anything in core habitat. There's too little of it left, certainly here in Vermont, and it could be argued there's too little really good core habitat left in the world. So our modus operandi there is to stay out and learn from those habitats, but not put human stuff there to start with.
Yep. Jump in, Will? Or
I would agree with both Bill and Sue, and it's a real challenge for Fish and Wildlife agencies. We are not well equipped for reviewing these projects. The projects are coming down fast and furious at us, and so it's very, very difficult. Having lived through one, as I mentioned earlier today, it's a real challenge with all the other work that we have to do to get out there and be part of it day after day, to look at all phases and so forth. And then, as we've talked about a little bit here, what questions do we really need to ask? We're not really sure about the questions even. And I might get a chance to talk about kind of a landmark study we did with American marten, but that's only one species. We don't know about the whole assemblages of species that have evolved up there and how they're impacted. Justin had a great picture, for instance, of the talus in rock slopes and gravel. What impact does it have to reptiles and amphibians that are crossing those broad expanses? Agencies are very taxed for dollars today in this economy. They're taxed for expertise. This wind is new, relatively speaking, and it's, again, as I said a few minutes ago, we just don't know all of the impacts that may occur, have occurred, and it will take decades, if not longer, to see those impacts. And so designing the questions, and then designing the studies, and then having the money to fund those studies, human nature being what it is, and money being what it is, folks want a quick answer and an open and shut case, and it's just not that easy in natural systems, especially up in these very delicate habitats, the most sensitive habitats that we have, frankly.
It seems
So usually these studies at best are funded for maybe 1 or 2 years pre-construction and maybe 2-3 years post-construction, probably where we probably need minimum, depending on the species, of 5 to 10 years, both sides of the project, really to obtain the information that's needed. And then likely wouldn't obtain all of it anyway. So.
we're all too willing to just say, well, but the solution is mitigation. So you get to have a bushel of apples instead of the bushel of peaches that we've destroyed on the mountain. And that you ask the animals that live there, is that satisfactory? Who knows? It's not an answer.
we're on somewhat limited time, but I want one more question I want to follow up on with you guys, which has to do a bit with this. Vermont recently completed a new biodiversity map, which I imagine was many years in the making. The goal was to highlight places in the state that are critical to our biodiversity. And I wonder if any of you could comment on, has that map yielded any new insights or sparked any new concerns vis-a-vis wind development?
I've seen that map, and one of the most impacted areas is going to be the Brighton to Seneca area. That is front and center on that map is an extremely fragile area that needs to be protected. So that's the one that jumped out at me on that map. And that is proposed for more wind turbines. And to add to that, the wind turbine people have been quoted as saying they need 200 miles of wind turbines in these rare areas of Vermont.
What impresses me about the map is what's not on it. Georgia Mountain's not on it. Ask the animals from amphibians and insects on up to the largest mammals how they feel about Georgia Mountain. Maps are great, they're a start, but again, the on-the-ground field work is needed, and as both Bill and Will have said, it's all too often not happening.
I've worked with that map some, and I think it does have some usefulness of identifying corridors. Like you say, the Senecas and Brighton area are very important as high elevation habitat, and corridors shows that the Sheffield area was a very important corridor that was lost. My concern also is the misuse of it. So, people look at that map and they think, well, this site doesn't have any rare endangered species, or it doesn't have a high priority. And much of that is because nobody's ever looked there. They've never done a survey there. So even though there's disclaimers that we shouldn't take it that way of absence of data, I fear that it's going to be used that way in many ways.
I agree.
Boy, that's just fascinating. Yeah, the idea of developing these installations with such unknown impacts on the wildlife habitat. And I really just would echo Sue's comments that all of these spaces are so precious, and it's so difficult to quantify what is worth developing and what we should be developing, what we shouldn't be developing. And at the end of the day, I think a lot of us at this table feel that the footprint of wind is simply too large and too destructive, really, to be a viable energy source for Vermont, because all of our habitat is so taxed and so precious. So.
Well, far better that we, in Vermont, and I think we're uniquely capable of this as a unique state culture, I think we really ought to focus on what we can do to save energy, what we can do to not use it in the first place. I mean, animals do this all the time. Their energy budget, they know the best way to save energy is to not use it. And I really feel that we need more of that in our day-to-day activities. Turn those shopping center lights off at night and drive slower on the interstate. And there's hundreds of ways we can save energy. Those are the real causes.
A smaller house.
Yeah, those are the real causes of our carbon footprint too, for that matter, the burning of fossil fuels. And, yeah, I don't know.
We're near the end of our hour. I don't know if any of you wanted to add anything else or topics we might have missed in the discussion.
Oh.
If not, I think we'll turn to Justin, who's going to read us some remarks to close out our discussion. So thanks again for joining us today.
After seeing the heavy destruction and fragmentation of the rare and extremely fragile montane ecosystems on these mountains, this destruction promoted by leaders who have high personal carbon footprints compared to the average person, I am driven to envision, in the far and distant future, after man has come close to destroying his own species, the result of his inbred quest for power in all its forms, coupled with his refusal to seriously tackle his rampant population growth. Archaeologists will visit the remnants of the wind turbine sites on the mountains in our region and wonder what went on there. These researchers will notice large, flat-topped platforms on the ridges and wide ramps beginning at the valley floors and winding their way up the mountainsides to those platforms, which platforms and ramps were carved out of solid rock by an obviously determined race of humankind from a long ago era. These scientists might conclude that those platforms were sacrificial sites, where something large and important was sacrificed. They would be right, but it was the large and important mountains themselves, cradling the rarest of ecosystems, that were sacrificed, the result of man's insatiable, grasping quest for power fueled by unsustainable population growth.